The Climate and Energy Minister, Chris Bowen, is convening an emergency meeting with his state and territory counterparts this week to address the gas crisis and has told Sky News it's a perfect storm facing our energy markets. He blamed the coalition for what he says is a lack of coherent energy policy for the past 9 years. The leader of the opposition says Labor are inexperienced and don't have the answers. Here to talk through the political news of the week is Matt Grudnoff from the Australia Institute and Dr. Sherry Sufi from the Institute of Public Affairs. Good to see you both. Thanks for joining us, gentlemen. First to you, Matt. Do you agree with Chris Bowen blaming the previous government for the position we're in now for the energy markets, or is there more at play here?
Well, I mean, the economic experts, the energy experts have been saying for years and years that unless we embraced a coherent strategy on energy, unless we had leadership at the federal level, the longer we delayed, the people who were going to lose would be energy users because the price was going to go up. And that's exactly what's happened. We've seen a lack of policy at the federal level for the last 9 years at least. Ever since the coalition got rid of the carbon price, they've had idea after idea for an energy policy for years and years, and they've all basically fallen over. And now we've seen gas prices go up, we've seen coal prices go up, and so those states that are dependent on gas and coal are going to see their electricity prices go up. But the energy sources that aren't going up in price, they're actually going down in price. Solar's going down in price, wind's going down in price, and batteries are going down in price. And those states that rely on those sources of electricity are going to see smaller price rises because they're not as dependent on coal and gas.
Sherry, you're in WA. They have legislation in place that keeps 15% of all gas produced for domestic production. Should Labor be looking at domestic reservation on the East Coast as well, despite a pushback from energy companies?
Yeah, look, it's an interesting question, Kenny. Western Australia has had this reservation policy for our domestic gas since all the way back in the days of Charlie Court. But the specific policy you're asking about was actually enacted by the Carpenter Labor government in 2006. It was subsequently inherited by the Barnett government and kept in place for those 2 terms and still is in place. And I tend to think that if we had a situation where 100% of our gas was being exported outside of Western Australia, it would undermine Western Australia's capacity to ensure that we have enough gas supplies for our own domestic consumption. So I think the 15% reservation policy has worked well for Western Australia. As for what happens on the East Coast is a matter for the East Coast to decide. But one thing I will say, Kenny, is that we're ultimately having this discussion here about a form of fossil fuels. Now, we have a situation where both sides of politics have currently committed to net zero by 2050, which is effectively a contested policy space that requires further community consultation and further debate. So if the net zero by 2050 policy is to be taken to its logical conclusion, we wouldn't be having this discussion. There would be no safety nets. And as the Institute of Public Affairs recent research has demonstrated, it would cost a total of 274 billion at the national level and 500,000 odd jobs. And this is something that we should oppose.
This week we also saw new Treasurer Jim Chalmers speak after the March quarter GDP figures were released. The numbers beat market expectation but showed a slowdown in the economy from the December quarter results. Matt, the Treasurer was also blaming the coalition squarely for this slowdown and painted a rather dire picture of where we're heading, pointing to spikes in the energy costs that we've been talking about and the $1 trillion in debts that we have to service with rising interest rates. As the new Treasurer, he was not about building confidence, was he, by being upbeat, more focusing on the challenges. What was your take?
Well, I think that growth was fairly strong, but the growth was patchy. What we've seen is that real unit labour costs, for example, which is basically how much workers get, how much businesses pay workers, actually went down. And so what we're seeing is, despite the really low unemployment rate and the talk of labour shortages, wages just simply aren't rising. And the consequence of that was also seen in the figures, that we've seen record high shares going to profits and near record low shares going to wages. And I think that's because the industrial relations system as it currently is basically rigged against workers. We have a system that we basically created that makes it really, really difficult for workers, even with really low unemployment, to demand higher wages. And I think there really needs to be reform in the IR space.
Sherry, is Labor making sure they are pinning all the bad things on the coalition at the start of their term? I mean, we've seen this before with previous governments as well, but what's your thoughts on this?
Look, the Labor Party are in their honeymoon phase at the moment, and as you say, it is completely natural for governments after winning elections to blame everything on the previous mob. As always, there's elements of truth to it as well as exaggerations. The reality is that something in excess of $1 trillion national debt is not in the interests of the Australian people. But we must remember that John Howard left behind a $20+ billion surplus in 2007. And so much of that $1 trillion figure that we've arrived at, yes, it is true that the coalition contributed to that as well, majorly, especially in the last term. But that debt actually started out during the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd years. Now, in the defence of the coalition, the previous term hasn't exactly been a conventional term in government. Nobody had foreseen that we would be dealing with a pandemic. And I would like to ask the Treasurer back, what would Labor have done differently? I mean, the more that Labor premiers around the country, like Dan Andrews in Victoria and Mark McGowan here in Western Australia, took us into lockdowns, the more it created the necessity for the government to come up with packages to assist Australian families and businesses. And this is how we ended up with JobKeeper and JobSeeker. Even if it took us slightly outside the fold of Liberal philosophy, it was a dire time. It was a dire situation. And I think the coalition did a pretty good job in nudging us along through that very, very difficult and unprecedented period. Ultimately, it's now up to the Labor Party to do something about that debt and fix the economy.
We've only got 1 minute left, but I really want to get both your thoughts on this, if you can, with short answers. The state of New South Wales, they're still chasing over $58 million in outstanding hotel quarantine bills by residents and interstate and international travellers as well, who had to pay for mandatory hotel quarantine when they came into the country. Some are saying they might take it to court because it was a public health measure. Matt, first to you and then to Sherry. What do you think about this? Do you think they should give up, or what do you think?
Well, I think if it was a public health measure, which it was, then the government should be responsible for it. I mean, these people had to go into quarantine to protect the rest of us, and the way we usually do that, those kind of issues, is that the public pays for the whole public benefit. So, I agree that them having to pay should be looked at.
Sherry?
Kenny, you want a short answer, mate? I'm on the side of the people. I don't think that they should have to pay for this.
There you go. It's settled then. Gentlemen, thanks so much. Matt Grudnoff from the Australia Institute and Dr. Sherry Sufi, thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure.